This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. On the presidential campaign trail, Donald Trump promised to overhaul U.S. immigration and deportation policies. In his first 3 months in office, he has kept that promise. His administration has halted some programs for refugees and detained and deported immigrants, some of whom are here legally. You might have heard of some of these cases, like the 2 Champlain Valley Union High School students who were recently ordered to leave the U.S. because the federal government suspended a legal parole program for Venezuelans. The administration has also revoked visas and green cards from university students who participated in pro-Palestinian protests. Today on the show, we'll be discussing 2 cases with ties to Vermont. There's Rümeysa Öztürk, a PhD student at Tufts University in Massachusetts. She was taken into custody at the end of March and was briefly held in Vermont and is now in Louisiana. And there's Upper Valley resident and Columbia University student Mohsen Mahdawi, who was taken into ICE custody earlier this week. 2 of our Vermont public reporters have been closely following these cases, Sabine Poux and Lexi Krupp. Sabine and Lexi, welcome to Vermont Edition.
Thanks for having me.
Hey.
And listeners, you can join this conversation as well, and we hope you do. Perhaps you have questions about these cases or an opinion to share about the apparent changes to federal detention and deportation policies. You can give us a call this hour at 800-639-2211. You can also send us an email, as some of you already have, to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Sabine, let's start with the case of Mohsen Mahdawi. Tell us a little bit about him and where he's from.
Yes, so Mohsen Mahdawi grew up in the occupied West Bank in a refugee camp. He came to the Upper Valley more than a decade ago. He lives in White River Junction and also has this property in West Fairleigh that he bought a few years back. He built a cabin there. He's a legal resident of the United States. And around here in the Upper Valley, Mahdawi has a lot of friends in the area of all sorts of backgrounds and faiths. Yesterday, I spoke with a minister at the Universalist Unitarian Church in Heartland and a rabbi in Woodstock, both of whom consider themselves dear friends of Mahdawi's. And he's also a student at Columbia University, where he's studying philosophy. He's supposed to graduate this spring. He's on the board of the Buddhist Association there, and he started the Palestinian Student Union a few years back with Mahmoud Khalil, another student who was taken into custody recently. Mahdawi actually stepped back from his activism at Columbia last year, in part because he was afraid it would hurt his prospects for citizenship here.
And speaking of that citizenship process, he was detained on Monday. What exactly happened, Sabine?
Yeah, so on Monday, Mahdawi was in Colchester for what he was told would be an interview for that citizenship process. There's a U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services field office in Colchester. That's where he was. And a bunch of his friends accompanied him and were standing by in the chance that the appointment was actually going to turn into arrest, though they were still holding out some hope that it would be an interview. Ultimately, it did become an arrest. Mahdawi was escorted out of the building in handcuffs. He's now being held at the Northwest State Correctional Facility in St. Albans. Now, the New York Times obtained a memo laying out the Trump administration's justification for detaining Mahdawi, which it says is because the protesting he's done at Columbia could, quote, potentially undermine the peace process in the Middle East. And they accused protesters like Mahdawi of stoking anti-Semitism in this country. But everyone I spoke to here in Vermont says that Mahdawi was not anti-Semitic at all. In fact, he was deeply concerned with reaching out to Jewish people and talking to them and building bridges, calling out anti-Semitism when he saw it. His friend Chris Halali says Mahdawi is a deeply peaceful person.
So not only was he Palestinian, now American, he was also a Vermonter now. So even added depth and dimension and complexity to his identity. And I think that Mohsen very much was proud to be here, was law-abiding, did everything by the book, was very happy to be here. But of course, he understood that the strength of the U.S. was the Constitution, our civil rights, and our civil liberties.
So it sounds like a lot of folks here in Vermont are speaking out on his behalf, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in just a minute. But first, Lexi Krupp, tell us a little bit more about Rümeysa Öztürk.
Yeah, she is a doctoral student at Tufts University studying child and adolescent development. She's a Turkish citizen and a Fulbright scholar and has lived in the U.S. for several years, since 2018. And she really loves academia. Her peers say she was working in a lab, working on her dissertation, and she was supposed to teach a class at the university this summer. And those plans are unclear now because at the end of March, she was walking in Somerville, near where she lives, talking to her mom on the phone, and several men approached her and surrounded her. They grabbed her hands, her phone. There's video of this online, and Rümeysa shared an account of what happened in her court filings. So those men told her they were police, but they were not in uniform. They brought her to an unmarked car, and she asked why she was being arrested. They wouldn't say. And in the weeks since, she has not actually been charged with a crime. But she was brought to St. Albans, Vermont, where she was held overnight. And eventually, the next morning at 4 a.m., flown to a detention center in Louisiana. And she's described conditions there as unsanitary and unsafe.
And that's where she is still being held today. How exactly is the Trump administration justifying her arrest?
So they've alleged that she engaged in anti-Semitic activities and made public statements supporting a terrorist organization. They're referring to Hamas here. But they haven't provided evidence of those claims. And unlike some of these other students who have been arrested, she was not really very visibly involved in any pro-Palestinian movements on campus. And according to a report from the Washington Post, a separate State Department memo said the Department of Homeland Security did not have evidence for those charges that they made. But she did co-author an op-ed in the campus newspaper last year, and that was calling on Tufts to acknowledge the Palestinian genocide, she wrote, and divest from ties to Israel. And so that's why her lawyers now are saying that she's been detained, that she's stuck in detention for an op-ed.
And Lexi, the reason we're talking about this case today, out of all the many different detainment and deportation cases that are going on right now in the U.S., is because she was sent to Vermont briefly overnight, but this case still has ties to Vermont. It isn't over yet. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so it was really unusual first that she was brought to Vermont from the Boston area. Multiple immigration attorneys have said they haven't heard of that happening. And the reason that she, a judge on Monday was listening to this case in Vermont is because when her lawyers made this legal challenge to her arrest, they actually didn't know where she was. And at the time, it turned out, she was in Vermont. So a separate judge has said, okay, that's the proper jurisdiction because that's where she was when you originally challenged her arrest. So that's why that's this continued connection to Vermont today. And this case is complicated because there's actually a separate immigration proceeding to deport her. Yesterday, she was denied bond in that case. And so after that, her lawyers have asked this judge in Vermont, this federal judge in Vermont, to speed up the proceedings and to either release her or return her to Vermont.
Well, let's take a call here. We have David calling in from Putney. David, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm so appreciated that you're having this program. And also for Rümeysa, I congratulate her for her Fulbright, for her dissertation about children and adolescents and social media. So I'm wondering about her health. And I wonder if, assuming we do get her in Vermont, if we can have her hospitalized or get her asthma condition improved. And I'll look forward to hearing the answer.
Thank you, David. And yes, there have been reports that she's suffered multiple asthma attacks while in custody in Louisiana.
Yeah, so she made this filing in court describing her arrest and her detention. And she has said, I think what the caller was referring to, that she's had multiple asthma attacks and has not been getting adequate medical treatment in Louisiana, that she was disrespected, her hijab was taken off her without her consent, and that she hasn't been given the medication she needs to treat asthma that she's had for a couple years.
Well, Sabine, we're talking here about two university students. They're both at non-Vermont universities. Columbia University has been targeted extensively by the Trump administration. It claims the university's discriminated against Jewish students, particularly in the administration's handling of pro-Palestinian protests last year. And Rümeysa Öztürk, as we've mentioned, goes to Tufts University in Massachusetts. Can you fill us in a little bit more on, with Columbia specifically, how it's responded to the administration's recent demands?
Yeah, so last month, Columbia actually agreed to make changes that the Trump administration was demanding in order to avoid losing $400 million in federal funding. Those changes include overhauling the school's protest policies, making changes to its Middle Eastern Studies department, according again to the New York Times, though it notes that more recently leadership at the university has struck a slightly tougher tone, at least outwardly.
And we should also note that Middlebury College is one of the 60 schools who received a letter earlier this year warning them about these anti-Semitism investigations on campus, and inclusion on that list could mean the college could also be targeted for potential cuts to federal funding. And Lexi, as we were talking about earlier, there's been a fair amount of protest activity, of people speaking out in support of these two students who we're talking about today. You were at a protest in Burlington on Monday morning outside the federal court where Rümeysa Öztürk's case is being heard. Can you describe the scene for us?
Yeah, there were hundreds of people, university students, retirees, union representatives, rabbis, people holding Palestinian flags, a ton of homemade signs, singing, chanting, as you can imagine. And I think we have some tape we can play from that.
Sharon Bihar, South Burlington, and I'm here because there's a large issue about what happened to this person is against everything that the United States stands for.
And a lot of people shared Sharon's sentiments, and also people stayed for hours. The protest started outside the courthouse around 8 a.m. And many, about 100 people stayed through the hearing until afternoon when Rümeysa's lawyers came out and made a statement.
So in your conversations that you both have been having with folks about these cases, I'm curious if either of you have spoken to members of the Jewish communities in Vermont and what they say about the broader debate that's going on, not just about free speech, but also Israel and Palestine. Lexi?
Yeah. One of the organizers of those protests on Monday was a group called Jewish Voice for Peace. So there were lots of people there who said they were Jewish. I spoke to a rabbi, and he said he does not agree with Rümeysa's political beliefs, but that this is really about freedom of speech and being able to talk to people who have different opinions.
Yeah. And Sabine?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I spoke with a rabbi in Woodstock, Rabbi Geof Taylor, who's a very close friend of Mahdawi's. They actually spoke on the phone Sunday evening before this supposed citizenship appointment. And he said that Mahdawi doesn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body. He said he's been coming to their seders for years and years at their house, and he's taken a lot of interest in learning more about Judaism and its parallels with Buddhism, which is the religion that Mahdawi practices.
And Sabine, briefly, what have Vermont's congressional representatives said in response to these cases? I know that Congresswoman Becca White, in particular, has been outspoken in the last few days on behalf of Mohsen Mahdawi, yes?
Yeah, the congressional delegation quickly released a statement on Monday condemning the arrest and the manner in which it was made. And on Wednesday, Becca Balint wrote to Homeland Security and State Department secretaries to, quote, demand answers on Mr. Mahdawi's arrest and for his immediate release. And 67 House Democrats have since signed the letter.
Sabine Poux joining us from White River Junction. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Lexi Krupp, thanks for being here with me in Colchester.
Of course.
Coming up, an immigration attorney and the state senator who represents Mohsen Mahdawi will share their perspectives on these two cases. You can also call in and ask questions. 800-639-2211 is our number. We'll take your calls in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are discussing two cases of university students who have been detained by federal authorities, even though they have legal status in the U.S. Mohsen Mahdawi is an Upper Valley resident who goes to Columbia University and has organized student protests there against Israel's military campaign in Gaza. And Rümeysa Öztürk is a Turkish PhD student at Tufts University. After being detained overnight in Vermont, she was sent to an ICE facility in Louisiana. A federal judge in Burlington heard arguments Monday on whether she should remain in detention. These two cases have led some Vermonters to question the state's role in federal immigration detentions. Here to tell us more is Brett Stokes. He's an assistant professor at Vermont Law and Graduate School. He's also the director of their Center for Justice Reform Clinic, which provides pro bono immigration law services. Brett, welcome back to the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your time. We are also joined today by Becca White, a state senator representing the Windsor district where Mohsen Mahdawi resides. Senator White, you were there when Mohsen Mahdawi was taken into custody. I understand that you know him personally as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the scene was like there in Colchester?
Yes, I'm still very shaken by the experience. What occurred is an unfathomable situation for, I think, any Vermonter. My friend, who I've known for just under a decade, was taken by masked men wearing hoods in a parade of unmarked vehicles who didn't tell us where they were taking him, who they were, wouldn't even identify themselves to me when I introduced myself as a state senator. The panic, the fear, it's. I feel like we're in an upside down world, and I wish this on no person. And, I'll speak more to Mohsen's character, but as such a peaceful, calm person, he left that building after being targeted by 3 masked men in an office complex building. He left calmly and peacefully, and I just have so much respect and appreciation for how he handled that situation where, as a bystander, I was in complete shock, panic, and I think all of his friends and family are experiencing that still and reliving it still.
And Brett, as an immigration attorney, I imagine that you've been speaking with lots of folks who have been feeling those emotions that Senator Becca White is describing. Have you been fielding lots of calls from clients in response to this apparent shift in the intensity of federal immigration action that we're seeing?
Absolutely. And just kind of as an anecdote, I kind of just by happenstance had just arranged for one of my clients to go and do a makeup appointment for a missed appointment that they had at the USCIS office that Mohsen Mahdawi was taken into custody at the following day. So you could imagine that they were understandably really, really terrified to set foot into that building, even though it was just a routine biometrics appointment. But to answer your question, yes, I've been fielding a lot of calls, not just from new and prospective clients, but also from my clients that I've been working with for years. They're concerned about, the news that's come out about Mohsen Mahdawi. They're concerned about, the news of this, new requirement about, registering and what role that's going to play in their lives. So this is certainly a time that, a lot of people are on edge.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the phones. We have a call from Carla in Enosburg Falls. Carla, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, I think it's Paula.
Oh, excuse us.
That's close, though. Hi, I'm calling. I was at the demonstration last night for Mohsen Mahdawi over at the Northwest Correctional Center, and that was another big protest with lots of people coming, lots of local people from Franklin County, and also people coming up from Colchester and Burlington and other places, too. And I just first I would like to thank Representative Becca White for her wonderful support of Mohsen Mahdawi, how she's really stood up for her constituent, and I hope all our representatives and our governor will stand up for these students in that strong way. To me, what seems to be illegal and unconstitutional behavior on the part of these of ICE and of all the people beyond, supporting this policy is really deeply upsetting. And part of it that's upsetting to me is the use of the charge of anti-Semitism. I think that's just a red herring. That's something that's being used in order to carry out a policy that's meant to intimidate all of us. The fact that our president was joking about homegrown criminals that could be picked up in this way and sent off to El Salvador was is just chilling.
Carla, I'm going to jump in here, and thank you so much for calling in. But I'd like Senator White to speak a bit more to Mohsen's character and beliefs, since, Senator, as we said, you knew him.
Yes, and Paula, thank you. You brought me to tears. This has been an exceptionally difficult time, both for me and our community. And I just am so grateful for Vermonters who have come out and spoken, both who have known Mohsen and also who have not, and have understood his character even from a distance. Mohsen is by far, I'll just say, his gentleness is disarming. I feel like we're in an upside down world where someone who has spread so much kindness and support in our community and is truly a bridge builder and is peaceful was targeted. And it just strikes, I think, at the core of Vermont's community. And I have so many constituents who have reached out to me who I didn't know that they knew Mohsen. I know him just in part because there's not a lot of people under 40 in the Upper Valley. And that's how we first connected. And then he was so active in our community through many different channels, including the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Heartland, which I'm a member of. And what I've been experiencing since his detainment has been just so many people reaching out to me and sharing stories of him as a person and just small things that he's done for them. And, you think you know your friends well, and then this scenario has just opened my eyes even further to gratitude for him. And I do just want to share one thing that he had a friend who was able to visit him, and he described, this is the kind of guy Mohsen is. He said on his experience in prison so far that the people here, to quote, people here need more kindness and more compassion. And he says that he feels at home even though he is in prison because he's been able to meditate. I mean, this is who we're talking about. And I feel if he can be targeted, if he can be taken, we are all at risk. And yes, that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you. And let me read a couple of emails here, some of which echo your sentiments, Senator White. Julia writes, the claim that these detentions we're discussing today are happening in order to combat anti-Semitism is disingenuous. The Jewish Council for Public Affairs released a statement which included this key point, quote, we reject any policies or actions that foment or take advantage of anti-Semitism and pit communities against one another. And we unequivocally condemn the exploitation of our community's real concerns about anti-Semitism to undermine democratic norms and rights, including the rule of law, the right of due process, and the freedoms of speech, press, and peaceful protest. And Tatiana in Westminster West wrote, I don't want Vermont law enforcement to assist ICE and the federal government spiriting detainees through our state in order to keep their whereabouts hidden from their lawyers. However, I listened to the proceedings in a Vermont court and was impressed by what appeared to be very thoughtful and fair questions put to the government's lawyers. If she, Rümeysa Öztürk, had been taken directly to Louisiana, this could not have happened. In the case of Vermont resident Mohsen Mahdawi, a federal judge was able to quickly keep ICE from moving him out of Vermont, enabling him to stay in touch with lawyers, friends, and family. On the other hand, if Vermont law enforcement played any role in entrapping him, I strongly condemn any such collaboration with the federal government's unconstitutional detention of someone based on violation of their right to free expression. On that note of quote-unquote entrapment, Brett Stokes, I'm wondering if you could explain for us the basics of the role, if any, that Vermont law enforcement have played in these two cases.
That I'm aware of, none. These are cases where ICE is acting alone. And that's based on the information that I have. So, for example, in the case of Rümeysa Öztürk, she was moved entirely by ICE through Massachusetts to New Hampshire into Vermont. Vermont law enforcement had nothing to do with her being moved through the immigration system like that. And I believe, as far as I know, they would have had no role in that to begin with. And on top of that, any role that what am I trying to say? That they wouldn't have had any role in the arrest of Mohsen Mahdawi either. That this is an arrest carried out by ICE.
Well, let's talk now about this push by some top Senate Democrats, including yourself, Senator White, to get Vermont to essentially stop allowing federal immigration agencies to hold people in Vermont's prisons. It would mean ending the state's contract with U.S. Customs and Border Protection when it expires in August. Senator White, can you just speak a little bit about your support for this?
Yes. One important clarifying point is that what the point of ending the Memorandum of Understanding with ICE would do is it would stop the shell game that we're seeing the feds play, which is what we were able to avoid in Mohsen's situation, where his lawyer, thank goodness for her, had pre-prepared a habeas corpus motion. So he was kept in Vermont. But we know that attempt to move him from Vermont to another state to avoid having a habeas corpus motion put forward is exactly what happened in Rümeysa's case, where there's this shell game of moving detainees to a new jurisdiction so that they can then be sent or deported without the original community that they're from being a part of that proceeding. So we need to stop that, because Vermont, our airports, our prisons should not be used for this purpose. But I want to be very clear in that I've heard concerns both from my constituents and from those who are familiar with Rümeysa's case that almost in this quagmire situation, we want people to be in Vermont. I don't know how better to put it, but we think they will be safer here. And I want to be clear that any change that we make to the MOU would not affect cases, to my understanding, like Mohsen's, because he was detained in Vermont. It was a filing in Vermont. It's to prevent the situation like Rümeysa's, where someone is taken from an outside state and brought to Vermont to then be sent away. And there is language that's being worked on by Senator Nader Hashim, who is the chair of the Judiciary Committee and very familiar and involved with this conversation. So I really have a lot of trust in that process. But obviously it's a strange position to be in, to feel that someone is safer in a Vermont prison than somewhere else.
Brett Stokes, I'm hoping you can weigh in here as well. With your legal background, do you support this change, or could it lead to potentially to people who might be detained being sent farther away from legal representation or their families here?
So in a perfect world, I absolutely support the changing of the MOU or getting rid of it altogether. Before the administration came in to power back in January, the fact that Vermont had such limited bed space, I did see used pretty frequently as they had to be pretty strategic about who they would detain, and as a result, people were detained with a really low frequency here in Vermont. And I think that really had something to do with the MOU. That being said, we're now dealing with an authoritarian regime. The actions that we're talking about today are straight out of the authoritarian handbook, and clearly an administration that has no it isn't going to abide by the rule of laws or lawful court orders, such as in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia when they were ordered to bring him back from El Salvador. I'm drifting a little bit here, but the fact remains, when we're dealing with an administration who is demonstrating themselves to be so unwilling to follow, similar circumstances that had been set up in the past, such as the situation that was working pretty well in Vermont, that changes. And what I'm seeing day to day with my clients, especially my clients who are detained, they are quickly moved out of the state. They're moved to Louisiana. They're moved to Texas. They're moved to places that are really hard for me, if not impossible for me, to locate them for days on end, even though I'm on file as their attorney. I'm, dealing with bureaucratic stonewalling by ICE in Louisiana and Texas, and just trying to get a meeting with my clients, having to pay exorbitant fees to have those meetings. So when we're talking about this, I'm torn, because in a perfect world, like I said, I would rather see an MOU like this end. But in the current state of things, in the state of the world, and dealing with this administration, I would rather keep my clients close. Well, I would rather keep them near their families.
Yeah. I want to play briefly here a clip from Governor Phil Scott, who spoke about this proposal yesterday.
You eliminate the contract, you cancel the contract, then what? Does it mean it stops people from being detained? Nope, it doesn't. Are they just sent someplace else that maybe they're not as safe as here? Yeah.
He also did condemn the feds for, quote, hiding behind masks. And he said the power of the executive branch of the federal government is immense, but it is not infinite and it is not absolute. That's a quote from Governor Phil Scott. We got an email from a listener who wrote in to say that Vermont should uphold its title as the brave little state by standing up for the First Amendment and the rights of U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens alike. One way of doing this, they propose, is by becoming a sanctuary state. Senator White, what would it mean exactly for Vermont to become a sanctuary state? I know this was something that was talked about a lot during the last Trump administration. Is it still a thing now?
That's a good question. I'm not totally familiar with what the provisions of a sanctuary state would look like. I did recently hear that the mayor of Burlington is moving forward with continuing that process. I support any move to no longer work with ICE. I mean, I have fully lost trust, and I think every Vermonter should, in their tactics, in their behavior, and their lack of due process. And it appears to me that we are in a situation now where, as our Congresswoman Becca Balint has put it, where we need to act together. In the moments when Mohsen was being detained, I called to people in the surrounding area and asked them to basically notice and be aware. And I think whether we have a legal sanctuary, city or state, at the very least, every Vermonter needs to be trained on what to do and how to react and to protect our own rights as citizens when what has now become inevitable continues to happen with the detainment of our citizens.
We got an email just now from Fran in Weybridge, who writes, if someone who is legally here in the U.S. can be pulled off the street by men in plain clothes, handcuffed, and sent to an unsanitary detention center, and not even charged with a crime for expressing her opinion in a college newspaper, what is in the future for the rest of us who want to exercise our freedom of speech? We are all at risk, and the best response is to speak up en masse. Thank you to everybody who wrote in. I'm sure we'll return to this conversation soon. So if you have continued thoughts or maybe an opinion that wasn't expressed in this conversation today, you can always email us at vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. State Senator Becca White of the Windsor District, thank you so much for your time today and for telling us about Mohsen Mahdawi.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Brett Stokes of Vermont Law and Graduate School and the director of their Center for Justice Reform Clinic. Brett, thank you so much for your time on Vermont Edition.
Thanks, Michaela.
Well, we have to take one more quick break here. Be sure to stick around, though, because in just a moment, we're going to hear from a callous poet who has some ideas for how you could fit poetry, singing, and art into your daily life. Sounds pretty nice, right? It's the latest installment of our regular series marking National Poetry Month. That's coming up on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. April is National Poetry Month. Every week on Vermont Edition in April, you'll hear from a poet who lives in our region. Today, we head to Calais, where Geof Hewitt lives. Every week at an open mic night at the Whammy Bar, he performs his poems, backed by a group of improvising musicians. He doesn't write poetry with performance in mind, but the music, he says, often drives the poem in unexpected ways. Geof Hewitt is the author of several books of poetry, and he's a retired teacher and language arts consultant for the Vermont Agency of Education. He's also Vermont's reigning Poetry Slam champion, a title he's held since 2003. You'll hear why in our interview, which we recorded just the other day.
Well, I have family in Vermont, and so when I got old enough to make a choice as to where I wanted to live, I came to Vermont to live because I like the rural aspect.
What were some of the lessons that you learned from those early years in Vermont, maybe about having more of a connection to the land or like hard skills?
Well, I had to learn it all. And, I never learned anything perfectly, for sure. I mean, I can tell you stories like I built an outhouse and I went to put a door on it, and the damned hinges, I'd put them in backwards or upside down or whatever, so the door was completely unwilling to open. Just a dodo using a chainsaw. It scares me to think of how cavalier I was.
When you moved to Vermont and then started getting this connection to working with your hands and being closer to the land and nature, were you writing back then in your time? Was this making its way into your poetry?
The answer is yes. It's all a piece. I write from imagination, but my experience is there too. And so, most of what I've just told you is in my poems. There's a lot of humor in learning, and mistakes are what make a story. So,
when did you start writing poetry?
When I was 17. When at night I clamber up the stairs into my room, visions of the days gone by over me doth loom. I picture long gone memories of a love that was so true, but mostly long gone, darling, I envision you. And that goes on for 4 more stanzas.
That's one of yours?
That's one of mine. The teacher gave me a C-.
On that poem?
Yeah. Well, yeah. He said I was out Shelleying Shelley. So that, that's kind of what my poems now, obvious, I hope, have no resemblance to the, slavish meter and rhyme. And I don't know whether what I write is poetry. I call them poems.
What else could it be?
Well, it can be chopped up prose. Looks like a poem. Who's to say?
But I do have a question from listening to your interview with my colleague Erica Heilman, who's the creator of the podcast Rumble Strip. When she interviewed you, you told her, I'm quoting here, "I'm not crazy about poetry. I like what I write, but I'm just as scared of it as anyone else." What did you mean by that fear? Are you still scared of poetry?
No, that's beside the point. No, I'm not scared of it. I don't read a lot of it. I'm close to illiterate, really. I mean, I have beautiful training, but I don't know, excuse me, I don't know much about literature in general. I'm angry with myself for my lack of knowledge.
You seem so knowledgeable about so many different things to me.
Well, I've given what leisure time I had to yakking on the page. That's it. I wasn't especially, I like my friends' work, people that I know and can immediately relate to the voice of the poem. And I've got 8 or 10 very dear friends whose work I really admire.
Where and when do you like to write?
Yeah, I like to write in the morning, but also late at night. When things are quiet and I've had, either fresh thoughts in the morning or old thoughts in the afternoon. But anytime, if now I've, mostly retired. So anytime I can pick up a pen, I will.
And you're known for being Vermont's reigning slam poetry champ. For someone who's never heard slam poetry before, how would you introduce it to them or describe it?
It's really just good spoken word. That's really what it is. The word slam is hype, but it was invented in a bar, and the bartenders were told to keep grinding the frozen cocktails, make any noise you have to make in your job, while poets were at the microphone trying to outsound the immediate environment. So a lot of hip hoppers were really good at that. And it's just good oral presentation of original work,
How did you get this title of reigning slam poetry champion?
Well, Michaela, I have to tell you that in 2003, I won Vermont's Poetry Slam Championship. I won by 1/10 of a point, and that was the final sanctioned Vermont championship slam. So there hasn't been one since, and I am the reigning champion.
You haven't had to defend your title since 2003?
Because there hasn't been an officially sanctioned title match, I have to claim that I'm reigning slam champion. Been there for 22 years.
The longest title holder.
Yeah, but I can tell you also that what slams I've entered since then, I probably haven't won a single one of them.
Are there places to go see and hear slam poetry in Vermont, or do you need to travel to another place?
No, I'm sure it's going on, but I have to tell you that it has waned enormously since COVID. And this is April, this is Poetry Month. And whereas a couple of years ago I had 4 or 5 gigs, I don't have a single one now.
Geof, I know you've taught poetry for many years. Why do you teach?
Because I love it. I love to teach. And mostly my workshops were all writing at the same time. I, offer a prompt and ask everybody to race as fast as they can. I run it as a race. Who can write the most in 7 minutes' time?
Why do you do that?
Because otherwise people spend most of the time with the pencil in their mouth thinking. And quick writing, I call it quick writing, others call it stream of consciousness, whatever. It's a way to generate surprise. And I explained it briefly to the students that you don't have to stick to the subject, You want to surprise yourself. You're going to write so fast, you're not going to be able to keep up with what you're trying to say. That's fine because we're going to spend time revising it. And they kind of dig that. And I dig it because I get my writing done. And there, if the teacher wants it, then there's a good, healthy focus on spoken word, taking it and articulating it in a way that the audience can really hear.
Okay, I have a question for you about reading poetry out loud. I've been to a lot of poetry readings, and I've noticed that there's this poetry voice or inflection that a lot of poets adopt when they start reading. A little similar, I guess, to the NPR voice that I'm sure many of us adopt when we have a microphone in front of us. But I wonder what you think of that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, absolutely. I wish I could imitate it, and I think I'm proud to say that I don't use that very often.
What role does poetry play in your life right now, either writing it or reading it, or what feels unique about your relationship to poetry in this stage of your life?
I guess that I'm every once in a while surprising myself by doing something on the page that I haven't ever thought of doing before. Most of it is not good. Most of it's not good. I know that. But I wouldn't get the good stuff if I didn't allow myself, a 97% junk. It's a matter of weeding through the junk and finding what you can pull out and fashion into a poem. Yeah. And I love doing it. So, revision gets a bad name because it's where it's at, as long as you take a free vision of what you're going to do in 7 minutes with your pen, if that becomes a daily habit. I used to work for the Department of Education, and I wanted to lobby for every school having a 7-minute quick write at the start of school. And if I were to lobby for something now, it would be 7 minutes of singing, something that raises the spirit and it becomes habitual.
Do you write or sing every day?
No. Well, I probably do sing every day. I probably do. In the car, if I'm alone in the car, you're glad I'm alone.
Well, Geof, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your interest, Michaela.
That was poet Geof Hewitt of Calais. We'll continue our National Poetry Month series next week. And you can find previous segments with Vermont's Poet Laureate Bianca Stone and Winooski High School student Mapenzi Selemani on the Vermont Edition podcast feed. Next week, on Monday on Vermont Edition, we're going to hear about a really fascinating new report from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture about how Vermont's dairy industry has changed over the past 10 years. Lots of interesting findings in there, including the fact that Americans' appetite for dairy products has apparently increased in the last decade. So be sure to tune in on Monday as we learn more. Today's show is directed by Aaliyah Papes. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Daniela Fierro and Andrea Lorian. Anna Berg is our intern, and our call screener is Rick Barrett. Our theme music is by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thanks so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.
It's 12:59. Stay with us for Here and Now. That's coming up.